Hey guys, it's your boy, Ballface8020, back again with another great commentary. So at the end of 2022, I made a video saying that the recession in the United States would begin in May of 2023. I said, and I've since gone back on that and said, look, I should have said September or even October. All of 2023 is gone, no recession in sight. So what happened? And the truth is, I didn't know for a long time. I couldn't figure it out because everything that I said was true. Like everything about the economic indicators all said that there would be a recession sometime between March of last year and October of, maybe November at the absolute latest. With this pseudo exception of housing, and like that was the one that was kind of iffy. But overwhelmingly, they said recession was coming, and it didn't happen. And I just couldn't understand why. And that's why, I gave up trying to predict when the recession would come, because it's like, well, almost all the indicators had hit. So it had already hit. So how would I don't even know what else am I supposed to be waiting for to hit. But I was looking at my favorite economic statistics, which is total debts and liabilities. The Fed publishes it, but they only publish it like once every 3 months, and it's actually 6 months behind. But it's well, I guess when they publish it, it's 2 to 3 months behind. I'm sorry, at least as far as I can gather. So that's the amount, and I've tried to explain this before. You can watch some of my other videos about economics if you want to know it. But basically, in the way that our economy functions, if you want to gather the money, if you want to know what the money supply is, you don't look at bullshit like the M0, the M1, the M2, which M2 is historically the most popular one, or even the MZM, which is the broadest way to measure the money supply. All of those things are fucking useless. Just ignore them. They don't mean anything. The only thing you need to look at for money supply is total debt outstanding. State debt, local debt, federal debt, and private sector debt. And you need to look at that. That's how much money there is. When that number goes up, you should see, some of that debt will go into economic growth, and anything that doesn't go into economic growth will go into inflation. Now there's no, at least as far as I can tell, there's no way to measure this much growth. Like if the debt grows 10%, then you'll have this much inflation, at least not in the short term. I can just tell you that over the long term, when you see the debt, that's diluting the purchasing power of the dollar, and it will cause price inflation. So the but anyway, so what happened in sometime, I think it was in early 2022, I don't remember exactly, the Fed started raising rates. And a lot of people, including myself, said this isn't going to work. This is going to cause an economic catastrophe. The U.S. is so indebted, both private sector and public sector, that it can't handle higher rates. This is going to collapse everything. And but they did it, and we're still here. And my thesis now is that those of us who said that were right. We were correct. And that it did collapse the financial system. It's just we didn't really notice it. Last year, in the spring of last year, you saw a banking crisis hit the United States and Europe. Silicon Valley Bank failed, one other big bank in the U.S. failed, and Credit Suisse failed in Europe. Now, those banks were they weren't, I don't know if they were saved per se, but they were backstopped, so depositors didn't get cleaned out or anything. They didn't take losses. And so here, what I believe happened is that was the crisis. That was the crisis that was going to bring everything down. And it would have brought everything down had the governments not aggressively intervened to save the financial system, save the banking system, and by extension, the entire financial system. You would have had cascading bank failures, insurance companies going bankrupt. just massive deflation from reduction in credit. Something that would be at least as bad as the 2008 financial crisis, probably worse. That's tough to tell, but it would have been at least the 2008 financial crisis, so the so-called Great Recession. But unlike the Great Recession, this time they were able to stop it. Why they were able to stop it and backstop it, sometimes they may have been more aggressive about it than they were. I don't know the exact details. All I can tell you is that they didn't backstop things in the Great Recession, although I know it wouldn't have been as easy to do that. And, again, for a lot of reasons that I couldn't understand or explain. They weren't able to do it in 2008, and they were able to do it in 2023. So now, okay, so let's go back a little bit. When they say the Fed's going to raise interest rates, how does that slow down inflation? And there's a few things to it. Like, for instance, when the Fed raised interest rates extremely high in the early 80s, I think it's like over 20%, and that supposedly stopped inflation. I don't believe that, by the way. That's like one thing, just because it caused such a severe recession and that slowed stuff down. Okay, I mean, it might have had some effect on the margins. I don't believe that was the main impact. That's a different debate. But over the long term, let's forget about this short-term thing. Over the long term, raising interest rates reduces inflation because it reduces the growth in debt, thereby reduces the growth in debt, which is the money supply. So if the money supply is not growing that much faster, it really can't inflate that much. Now, there are things that can happen, like the currency itself can lose its purchasing power. Like, for instance, just a thought experiment. And I know I'm all over the place here, and I apologize, but this is all important, and this is as condensed as I can make it. Let's just say the money supply stayed the same, but overnight there was half as much, fuel available, half as much food available, half as much electricity available, half as much, medications available. If the money supply stayed the same, you would see huge price increases just because the actual wealth has been reduced in relation to the money supply. And on the other hand, you could have a situation where the money supply dramatically increased. Let's say the money supply doubles, but the amount of actual wealth out there, when I say wealth, I mean energy, labor, real estate. They're not making any more real estate, but let's say theoretically they were making more land and resources and stuff. If that all happened, you would have say the money supply increases by a factor of 2, but the total wealth in the economy increased by a factor of 4. You would have prices going down despite the money supply increasing. I hope that you can follow me there. But generally, that's not how things work. Generally, the economy's wealth is what it is. It might get a little bit bigger, it might get a little bit smaller. It's not going to change dramatically. And big changes, so if the money supply goes way up, you're going to see that inflation. The money supply goes way down, you're going to see deflation or reduced prices. Okay. Anyway, here's what happened, right? The Federal Reserve kept raising rates in 2022 and into certainly a large part of 2023. Not sure exactly when they stopped in 2023, but everybody said it was going to break something. And the inflation, now the credit supply, the money supply, total credit, grew massively during the first 2 quarters of the pandemic, just a huge rate. Because normally, pre-pandemic, U.S. total credit growth was about 4.5% a year. The first 2 quarters of the pandemic, total credit increased at a rate of about for those 2 quarters, it was like probably like 18, almost 19%, over the course of those two. I mean, at an 18.9% rate, of a yearly rate over those 2 quarters. Even after that, you continued to see high credit growth for a couple quarters, like 7%, and then I think 5% or something, other than like 5 or 6, I can't remember. But it was trending down. It was trending down even after those first 2 quarters. It was trending down while we were still in the pandemic. Well, also the thing to keep in mind is during those first 2 quarters, you had a reduction, or at least in the first quarter, at least. I'm not sure about the second. I can't remember. But you did actually. In both of those quarters, you had a reduction in the overall wealth of the economy because the whole economy was shut down. So you did have the economy get smaller while the money supply grew dramatically. Despite all that, you did not see much of a rise in prices during those first 2 quarters. Those didn't show up until, quarters down the line. And, it was going to take a while for that to work out of the system. Even had the money supply stopped growing completely, it would have taken a while. The money supply didn't stop growing, though. It continued to grow at an elevated rate for at least 2, maybe 3 more quarters. I can't remember. When I say elevated, I mean over 4.5% a year. But eventually it normalized until the first quarter of 2023. Okay, now the first quarter of 2023, the total credit growth in the U.S. economy was 2%. It was a 2% annualized rate. 2%. We haven't been there since. Well, I mean, actually, we did. There was a few times in the Great Recession where we were like that, but not since like the Great Recession. No, and before the Great Recession, not until I think the immediate post World War II period. I don't know exactly, but that's like but I think like 1946, and before that, not until till like, it was 1931. And you remember what was happening, 1932, I mean. You remember what was happening then. Oh, that's not true. There was a little bit in 1937, I'm sorry, which was like the second leg of the Depression. But the thing is, it wasn't just 2%. It was trending down. It was trending towards 0 or even going negative. That was what was going to happen. And that 2% growth was enough to collapse the banking system in the United States and by extension Europe. And those governments had to step in and bail out those banks. Had they not done so, the whole house of cards would have come collapsing down. It would have crashed right then and there. The value of the dollar would have gone way up, but the economy would have gone to shit. Like I'm talking like definitely double digits unemployment, having to nationalize the entire banking sector, probably big budget cuts, and just it would have been bad. It would have been bad. It wouldn't have been the Great Depression because the things were just structured differently then, but it would have been at least the Great Recession, and I think probably worse. I don't know for certain though. So they decided to step in and save it, and that bought everybody some time. However, backstopping the banks, there is being done like everything else with government deficit financing. So the banks are backstopped, and credit is now growing again. So, on one hand, they say the Fed's trying to fight inflation, but the fact is, the whole point of raising interest rates is to reduce the growth in credit. That's the entire point. Everything else is, and I know that even they don't understand this, but everything else is tangential. The whole point of what makes raising interest rates effective for slowing inflation is because it slows the growth in the money supply. So yeah, the Fed still has high rates, but that doesn't mean shit if the money supply is growing. So yes, we had that 2% thing, and then the banks were backstopped, and lo and behold, second quarter of 2023, I'm sorry, not second. Okay, I'm sorry. The first thing was, I don't know what the first quarter of 2023 was, but the second quarter of 2023, when everything started to collapse, when the banking crisis happened, and it really looked like we were going to hit a recession last May, credit growth that quarter was only 2%. In the third quarter of 2023, after the banks had been bailed out or backstopped, and credit, the United, somehow, I don't know exactly the mechanism that they're doing this beyond government deficits, but deficit spending, total debt, however, whether it be private or public, was increased. That following quarter 3, it was 3.8%. Still below the 4.5% rate, but going up. In fact, it's almost doubled over the previous rate of 2%. Then, in the fourth quarter of 2023, which is the last quarter we have data from, credit rose by 5.8%. 5.8. So that's over 1.3% over the 4.5% we were at pre-COVID. And now we don't have the data for the first quarter yet. We won't have that until May at the earliest, probably sometime in early June. My guess is it's going to be 6, 7, or even 8. And that increase, you will see that increase in the money supply's effect on prices 6 to 10 months down the line, possibly even earlier. This is the reason we are seeing this pretty much unprecedented rally in gold. The only time we've seen a rally in gold like this was during the 70s inflation, when after the U.S. defaulted on the gold standard. And, back then, people like me, people like us, and the people who we follow in economics, back then, everybody thought that was the end. Like, the people on our side all thought that was the end, that this whole Ponzi scheme was about to collapse. But it turned out not to be the case. It turned out there was that. After that, the U.S. did have to default on the gold standard. And yes, that did cause very severe inflation for the entire decade of the 70s. That didn't really completely end until the mid-late 80s. But it did. The consumer price inflation, at least, the total credit growth continued to be, 10% a year. But that whole cycle kind of ran out in 2008. And after the Great Recession, yes, it recovered, but it recovered, it recovered. Credit growth was at a more sustainable rate of 4.5% a year. But that was always on borrowed time because it relied on bigger and bigger federal government deficits. And that 4.5%, and even then, pre-COVID, we were a few months away from another recession. I'm not saying it would have been 2008 level bad, but we would have been in a recession had COVID not hit. And I don't know how bad it would have been. But COVID spent everything up to the end game faster. That recession probably wouldn't have been the end of the dollar. Whatever's going on now will. We may very well avoid a recession, but only by destroying the dollar. You're seeing last time gold rallied back in the 70s, that wasn't the end. We had every reason to believe it was the end, but that's because we'd never seen in this extended experiment in full fiat money before. So we didn't know, we had no reference point. So that's why, the way it survived caught us by surprise. There are no surprises left this time. I guess you always say that until you get it. But economically, the math is the math. There's nowhere else to hide. This rally of gold is not going to be for 10 years. It's not going to be something for 10 years that then stops. This one is going to be, this is permanent. You're seeing a permanent repricing of gold and, by extension, silver. That means ultimately the end of the United States dollar as a reserve currency. Now, by itself, it doesn't mean the dollar is going to inflate its way to nothing. I would expect that it probably will, just because how else would it end? But that's more speculative, and there's no way to tell at this time. But what I can say for absolute certain is we are in the beginning of the death stages of the dollar. And like I said, I do expect, and confirmation of this hypothesis will be in early June when we get the total credit growth data for the first quarter of 2024 in the United States. My guess, 6, 7, even 8%, like I said. And the quarter after that, 10, 12, 14%. It's not going to stop. And the and then the dollar, I don't know how long the dollar is, but I can tell you that gold is going to go to the moon, silver is going to go with it, and this is going to happen in the immediate future. You're going to start. It's not even you're going to start. It's already started. But I'm saying this process that has already started with the gold stuff is going to accelerate. So, overall, what I'm trying to say is you don't need, for those of us who have been watching, whether you want it or not, whether you want the recession, whether you want an economic reset, I think that an economic reset is just necessary politically, socially, and economically. And I think that the current system, especially these last few years we've seen, it's impoverishing people. Take away politics out of the equation for a second. All of us are hurting right now. It could be a lot worse. I'm not saying historically we've got it great compared to other people. Okay, I get that. But people are, it's getting very hard in the United States, the wealthiest country in the world, one of the wealthiest countries in the world. It's getting increasingly hard for a huge portion of the population just to make ends meet, to pay their bills. I sell insurance. I see this every day. People can't make these payments. The rates are insane. And then they've got rents that are insane. And then food isn't as bad as it was, but the food is still pretty high. So yeah. But anyway, so the thing is, we'll stop waiting. We can all stop waiting on a recession or a banking crisis or collapse. That's not going to happen. I can't say that for certain, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think what you're going to see instead is ever accelerating inflation. I think it's already started, this re-acceleration of inflation, that I think with the regrowth, because I'm not looking at prices, okay? I don't care about prices. I'm just talking about the growth in the money supply, i.e. the credit supply. Because it's 2%, it stopped dead, pretty much. Then 3.8%, then 5.8%, and then we'll see, are these next quarters, are they going to be 6, 8, 10, 12? And then it will only accelerate. And then before you know it, year or two, you're Argentina. The U.S. dollar's worthless, and that changes everything. Because from that, once the U.S. dollar becomes worthless, every country in the world, including those countries that hate the U.S., start having to just use real money, not fake money. I'm not saying they won't still have national currencies or paper money, but it will have to be 100% backed by real assets, be it land, gold, silver, whatever. Yeah. That's all for now. See you in the next.